Hello and welcome to this special broadcast here on ETV Bharat. I'm Smita Sharma, and today in this special conversation, I'm joined by Amar Sinha, who was India's former ambassador to Afghanistan, currently also at the National Security Advisory Board, so advising the government, in fact, on a whole lot of security issues. But today, what we're going to talk about is the neighboring country of Afghanistan. There have been a series of developments with a lot at stake for India. We saw that US-Taliban peace deal being signed in February this year. Also, in fact, a power sharing agreement which was concluded just on Sunday between the rival political powers of President Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah, which allowed for Abdullah, in fact, to lead the intra-Afghan talks with the Taliban, in the days to come. But since then, the kind of attacks that we've seen within the country, the kind of bloodshed that we are seeing, is the peace deal really sort of standing up? Is it really holding up, or does it stand at a great risk at this point in time? And why is it so important for India to be looking at all these developments very closely? Will India be in a position to engage with the Taliban directly? Are some of the questions that I'm going to put forward to Ambassador. Now, to begin with, the peace deal that we saw being signed amid much fanfare in February in Doha, do you think it's very fragile at this point in time? Or is it already on the verge of a collapse?
Well, let me start by saying that it was not a peace deal, really. It's an agreement between the US government and Taliban, which says that it is an agreement to bring peace to Afghanistan. The peace is the end result of the intra-Afghan talks, as per that agreement. And that agreement of 29th of February really talks about withdrawal of US troops and provides certain timelines. Also provide certain commitments in terms of the number of prisoners to be released, when the talks should begin, what are the exact dates when US would remove the sanctions, remove the UN to ease the restrictions on the travel of Taliban, etc. Yes, it has run into trouble because I think to begin with, the timelines are very ambitious. It was clashing with the formation of government and the announcement of election results in Afghanistan. Both these processes are running parallelly. In fact, the date for commencement of the intra-Afghan talks was 10th of March, while, as you know, President Ghani and Dr. Abdullah were sworn in only on 9th of March. Of course, it was a parallel ceremony of two presidents swearing in. And thankfully, that has now been resolved, as you mentioned. So I think that's a very important step of the Afghan political elite to at least have come to a common platform where they can now seriously engage the Taliban in intra-Afghan talks.
But whatever you saw as far as, that agreement between US and the Taliban was concerned, and Zalmay Khalilzad, the US Special Envoy, has been, in fact, leading those talks. What are your worries here in terms of how much at risk could the democratic gains in Afghanistan that were made over the past decade and more stand to lose? How much at risk are those democratic gains and values?
See, if that agreement unfolds the way it is written down, I don't think we should have issues because that really enjoins Taliban to come back as a political mainstream party to engage with the Afghan government and Afghan sides, unfortunately, that agreement says. But if that is implemented in good faith by the Taliban, I think it will lead to some good result and outcome because ultimately everybody wants the violence to end, most of all the Afghan people. And of course, that also gives certain commitments on Taliban cutting links with different terror groups. Importantly, once they come back to Kabul, I think more than terror groups, they will have to also cut links with the sponsors of terror. And they have been a beneficiary of it for the last 18 years.
But that agreement in Doha also, in fact, there was that understanding that you mentioned to reduce violence by up to 80% in the prelude to negotiations over a power sharing agreement. Now, the way we have seen fighting erupt back over the past 24 to 48 hours, at least 20 of the country's 34 provinces have been witnessing fighting, strong fighting, encounters, battles. And in fact, President Ghani has now been forced to change his position from active defense to offensive. So where does this cycle lead now?
You see, that agreement really, unfortunately, from our perspective, did not include any condition or did not impose any condition on Taliban to cut down violence against Afghans and Afghan security forces. all it said was that there would be a reduction of violence for 7 days. That was the time given to the Americans. And the commitment is that Taliban will not attack American and its allies. So there was no commitment on Afghan government or stopping their violence in the provinces, as we said. And yes, we did see a spike, though UNAMA has reported that civilian deaths in the first quarter have been less. Taliban has not announced its spring offensive. But even without announcing that spring offensive, which they do each March or April, the level of violence has been substantial. There are reports which suggest that Taliban would like to capture at least a couple of provincial capitals before they enter the intra-Afghan talks, because in their mind they feel that they would be negotiating from a position of greater strength. As it is, I think so much of legitimacy given to Taliban has emboldened them more than they perhaps needed to be emboldened before they got into the talks. But anyway, that is their military strategy as of now.
But when we're talking about these series of attacks, we've seen, of course, that attack in a Gurudwara in which the minority Sikhs were targeted. We've seen an attack on the maternity ward hospital, heartbreaking, in fact, visuals coming out of that hospital attack. Also, several of the security posts, the outposts, in fact, being attacked in Kunduz. Now, the President Ghani continues to believe that these are attacks which have been orchestrated by the Taliban. But Zalmay Khalilzad tends to believe that these are attacks being orchestrated by the ISIS Khorasan. We've just seen, in fact, a release of a report by the by the Inspector General of the Department of Defense in the United States, which says that ISIS is around, though it might be weakened. How does India see both these narratives and both these claims?
See, the fact is that all these terror groups are interlinked. It's very difficult to distinguish one from the other. They share their resources, they share their men, they share their tactics, ideology, everything. So I think to get back to a position of differentiating between good terrorists and bad terrorists, I think is not a right policy. And these attacks have a particular meaning. They are basically underlining the urgency. You see, it's playing on the psychology of really war-weary Afghans and putting the government under pressure that unless you submit to every condition that we have asked for before we start the intra-Afghan talks, a lot of innocent civilian lives will be lost. And of course, it has been very convenient that there are other groups which have come up in the last couple of years who have started taking credit for these attacks, which Taliban would have found very difficult to justify. So these are games that are being played, and I think we should not necessarily judge it that which group is. The fact is that the continuing violence in Afghanistan has a history, it has a certain background, and Afghans know that, and I am sure Mr. Khalilzad also knows it. But right now, I think it is expedient to exonerate Taliban of every such responsibility, because Taliban is being presented as something that has changed, that is now a political force, not a force for violence. That is yet to be proven on the ground.
But having said that, as you mentioned, that you cannot go to discriminate between good and bad Taliban. That has been one of the red lines that New Delhi has drawn for the longest. And despite that, of course, we did see a certain kind of a change in approach when you were one of the 2 retired ambassadors who represented non-officially New Delhi in the same room with the Taliban in Moscow some months back. Having said that, the Army Chief General Rawat during the Raisina dialogue also said that India should join the bandwagon in terms of talking to the Taliban. Where is the scope for India engaging with the Taliban directly?
See, India will engage with all factions in Afghanistan. It is very clear. It's an immediate neighborhood. Every political force we should be willing to engage. But let Taliban at least prove that it has turned into a political force and it has eschewed violence and stopped killing Afghans. See, and what others have said, I've heard those statements. I am not a believer that India in its own neighborhood needs to be joining bandwagons. I think it should be having its own policies and should remain confident enough to be able to shape outcomes in our region. Otherwise, I think our talk of being a regional power, emerging power, etc., is, I think, very seriously undermined by this sort of an outlook that we necessarily have to join the narrative created by others in our own region. On our going to Moscow, well, we were sent as non-official. It was the first time that Taliban had engaged with regional countries. Russia also went ahead and then did an intra-Afghan talk, which I think was a very historic first in a way. It had democratized the entire negotiations. If you notice, before that, this was an entire negotiations which led to the US-Taliban agreement was basically a bilateral discussion between the US government and Taliban government. Except for the host Qatar, I think there was nobody else in the room unless somebody from ISI was masquerading as Taliban and sitting in the room. No other country, not even NATO, not Afghanistan, which are main parties, were there. So there was no question of India joining the Doha process, in a sense. Today, I think we are in a much better position, and there's a great opportunity for India to play a very constructive role. And that flows from the fact of our neutrality, of our having had a consistent policy of supporting the democratic and Republican Afghanistan, of having links with all the entire spectrum of political leadership in Afghanistan. So I guess the message that we have to send out is that it is time that all Afghans, including the Taliban, need to sit together and bring an end to this war which has been killing each other. And the only test I would actually put to Taliban if they want to really distance themselves from terrorism, because they have publicly stated that ISIS is their enemy. No, ISIS is killing Afghans. It is an enemy of the Americans. It's an enemy of the Afghan state. So why can't Taliban join, when it says that it controls 30% of the territory, has a lot of presence? It should join Afghan forces in fighting the ISIS. And I think that will be the clear test that they are really behaving like a nationalist force, which is trying to also do something to protect its own citizens rather than just killing them.
But does India really have the luxury of time, to actually keep watching the situation play out by itself in terms of not actually going into that room and talking to the Taliban? We saw that hurried visit in a way of Zalmi Khalilzad to New Delhi, post which there were signals, and he also gave an interview where he, in as many words, literally said that New Delhi should get into that room with the Taliban. And given the pending troop pullout with the US presidential elections coming up in November, there is that sense of desperation in Washington, D.C. So does New Delhi really have the sort of, the luxury of time to be sitting here and looking at the developments?
See, one thing is clear, that nobody can perhaps force the pace of intra-Afghan talks. If you look at the US-Taliban agreement itself, while there are timelines for US withdrawal, there is no timeline when intra-Afghan talks will end. So to say that we don't have luxury of time, I think is not really correct. Ultimately, it will for the Afghan people to decide when they will reconcile, whether they are willing to forget and forgive each other and come back in the fold. And that is also for Taliban. And Taliban, I guess, would pace itself in a way that it drives maximum benefit politically, what they want. So we'll see. And to say that we are not doing anything, I don't think is the correct read. No, there are a lot of things in these negotiations or reconciliations which are not necessarily done in public. But behind the scenes, I'm sure our embassy, ambassador, other officials are active. They are counseling at least the Afghan government. And Mr. Khalilzad came here basically so that India uses its influence in resolving this political deadlock in Kabul. And I'm sure back channels would have worked, because we did see some results. It could have been because of the American insistence, because of counseling from Iran, from India, because everybody was busy telling the two sides that it is absolutely essential that they get together, and the election should not be seen as a winner takes it all situation, because that would leave Kabul leadership in a very disunited sort of situation.
So are you indicating that the back channels are in some way on between?
Well, I'm not part of it. I'm not part of it, but I'm sure government of India doesn't sit on its back all the time, and there are a lot of things that are happening. And, some things, I guess, are best done quietly.
Right. But
especially when you're dealing with your own friends. You see, our problem is that we have too many friends there. So you can't take sides. You can't pick one over the other. So you have to quietly convey your concerns, your requests to them, and what is perhaps the best way forward.
I mean, there are a lot of friends, and there are also a lot of old memories, including scars, the ones like the hijacking, the plane hijacking incident.
This hijacking, actually, I have spoken to some former Taliban members when I was in Kabul. This hijacking, I think it has become a very iconic sort of a thing about Taliban. But Taliban has a totally different perspective on the hijacking. You see, they say that we were not the hijackers. It was the Pakistanis who hijacked the plane from Nepal. It was not even done in Kabul. In fact, they say that we actually did a humanitarian gesture for India. That aircraft was not being allowed to land anywhere in the world. It was running out of fuel. And then at the request of the then Indian ambassador in Islamabad, who had raised their ambassador in Islamabad, who had conveyed a message to Mullah Umar that Kandahar airport was opened at night and the plane landed. Now, our grouse begins there, that when the prisoners were released, why didn't Taliban capture them and give it back to us? And there, most of the people that I have spoken to who were with the Taliban regime then, say that, Ambassador, you yourself say that Taliban regime was controlled from outside. We didn't have control on every aspect of our policy. So we did the best we could to help India to save civilian lives. And now what happened with those kidnappers and the people you released, you can't blame us for that. So you see, they have a totally different perspective than I see 814.
But, their perspective could be something, but we've seen the kind of divided opinions that have sprung up, from DC to Kabul to Delhi. Every time these issues have surfaced, including this urgency of wanting New Delhi to join hands or get into the room to talk with the Taliban, the opinions seem vertically divided. There's also this entire chatter about whether there's been a change of heart as far as the Taliban and the situation in Kashmir is concerned. So these are all, in fact, very divisive narratives at this point in time.
See, I don't think Taliban has ever said that they are interested in Kashmir or they are interested in the dispute. That is an attempt by certain sections in Pakistan to link these two issues. They want to link it for a very simple reason, because that is how they feel that they could get Americans to intervene in this, because for them, the Afghani part of the equation for Americans is very important. For Pakistan, of course, both parts of the equation are equally important, and they would like a certain equivalence or a linkage. And Taliban has said it not only 2 days ago, but even when Article 370 was changed. If you remember, Pakistani Foreign Minister had immediately said that this is going to affect the pace of negotiations in Doha. Then too, Taliban spokesman had immediately come out and said that these two issues are not connected at all. Article 370 is something that is internal to India, and we respect that, and we see no connection between the Kashmir issue and Taliban. Last week, we saw this great hype on social media of certain Taliban statements about Kashmir and how they will snatch it away, etc. But I think that was mischievous, and that is why Taliban spokesmen, both Mr. Shaheen and Stanagzai, had to come out and clarify it. So I think that should rest that controversy. It is needlessly, there are sections who would like to do that. But I don't think Taliban or Afghans have the amount of ill will for India which Pakistan would want them to have.
On the subject of Pakistan in the past, of course, also, in your previous interviews, you said that the Taliban's policies are too heavily governed by Pakistan, and until those ties are loosened, it will be pointless for India to make a move. Has India been seeing Afghanistan too much? I mean, we have, of course, India has invested $2 billion plus in terms of aid and assistance to that war-torn country. But when it comes to its strategic and foreign policy objectives within Afghanistan, has New Delhi been seeing Kabul too heavily, maybe, too much more than required from the prism of Rawalpindi?
Not at all. In fact, and that will be the wrong perspective to look at Afghanistan from Pakistani prism. You see, you have to look Afghanistan from the prism of your own neighborhood and SARC, for whatever is left of SARC. But the fact is that the SARC -1 is still functional and is working. So I don't think we should look at Pakistan. Pakistan has a role to play. Unfortunately, that has been a negative role till now. So we have to do everything to neutralize that. But our approaches to Afghanistan have primarily focused on humanitarian assistance, on capacity building, on rebuilding of infrastructure, and so that it actually leads to peace and prosperity in our neighborhood. Because we do believe that peace is indivisible, and we'll need peace in our own region if India had to continue to grow, etc. But yes, from Pakistan's perspective, as I said, that they see this as part of one equation, and they want to leverage one for the other. But that is also something which should be rejected, and there's absolutely zero equivalence.
I mean,
Whatever be their grievances.
Are the hesitations on New Delhi's part justified, citing the Pakistani establishment and what it is doing all the time?
Sorry, I didn't get your question.
The hesitations that people, blame New Delhi for in terms of not playing a far more active role in Afghanistan and its reconciliation process, is that something that stems out of maybe, unjustified looking at this constant Rawalpindi-Kabul equation?
Maybe partly. Partly, I also feel that the strategic community gets tired of any policy, whether it is right or wrong. After 5 years, they all want change. And this is what I keep pointing out, that look at Pakistan. It has followed one policy for 18 years. You see, and it has at tremendous cost to itself. No, I think we should not underestimate the costs that Pakistan has undertaken, both in terms of human losses, the blowback from its policies of supporting terror, the financial mess that it has landed itself in. But they have, for bad or good reasons, they have followed a certain path. And today they feel that they are very close to the finishing line.
Right.
Now, issue is, will they let go of Taliban and let them reconcile in Afghanistan and actually run a country independently as a sovereign country? And that is what I have been arguing, that once Taliban comes back to Kabul and it's proven to be a nationalist force which is focused on Afghanistan and deals with the rest of the world as a sovereign nation, India should have absolutely no hesitation, and it should continue with the policy. Taliban has also said that they have welcomed India's development partnership in the last 18 years. They have never attacked any of our projects that we have been building there, except for some attacks on
kidnappings.
Well, kidnappings have happened, but kidnappings also have local and economic factors which sort of instigate these incidents. There were attacks when the Delaram-Zaranj road was being built. From the Parliament, Salma Dam, etc., it has never been attacked. And this is something that we should take note of.
So, in fact, in one of your earlier suggestions, you said that maybe at some point India could actually think of hosting a Jirga or a Grand Council meet. Are there takers for your suggestion here in South Block?
No, that Jirga or Grand Council was not the traditional Jirga that Afghans do, which is a national consensus building. This was more in the context of the fact that there are over 40,000 or 50,000 Afghans living in India. These are all the youngsters, the youth who are in universities, families which have been displaced, etc. So I had used the term Jirga, but basically to create a platform for these people to articulate their views. You see, there are expatriate groups in Canada, UK, even Moscow, which have been sort of coming together and at least trying to bring all factions together. So it was in that context that what is it that the youth and the educated youth of Afghanistan wants for its own country in the future? Because their voices, one unfortunately has not heard very much in this entire intra-Afghan talks and discussions that have happened in the last 18 months.
Okay. So just the last two questions then. With India closing down 2 of its consulates recently, citing COVID-19 challenges, is New Delhi reading the tea leaves right on that?
Well, in fact, I read this only in the, I think, one of the newspapers or magazines recently. I had heard that there were, you see, Herat and Jalalabad, I think because of the location, I can understand that there was a fear of this virus. Herat was badly affected. It was one of the first places where it started, and it got imported from Iran. So I think the reasons that I know are that it's related to COVID, And these could be temporary measures, and they will wait and watch, because to get assistance to people in Jalalabad and Herat when the COVID is there and when the lockdown is imposed would be difficult. So it just could be a medical precaution.
So finally, from whatever negotiations you've seen happening in Kabul, in Doha, how much of an assurance do you get that if the Taliban, in fact, if this does go through, it will not be the late 90s kind of a situation again? And also, what are India's really sort of the big fears about the security situation spillover at this point?
See, our worst fear really should be that the Taliban has not changed at all, and it wants to go back to a 1996 situation, because then the Afghan society will get deeply split.
Right.
And I think we can see going back to the old times of serious fighting happening, like a civil war. So that is the worst case scenario. Our own understanding, if you go by what Taliban has been saying in public, that yes, or even to their interlocutors, that apparently they have changed. They're not looking at complete monopoly on power. They're willing to share power. So, but these things are still untested. They will have to come back first into the negotiating fold. Negotiate with whatever sides or the body that has now been created, and then come out with a blueprint. Of course, certain leaks have taken place about Taliban's wish list and how it wants to see the country. They have denied it, but if one has to go by that, then obviously there's not much change. See, on some of the key issues, let's put it that they have not been very clear and forthcoming about rights of women, about democracy, about the role of Afghan security forces. They have been sort of fudging. But on other things which concerns the international community, I think they have made the right noises. They have said that we have changed, we are willing to cut links with all terror groups, we want to negotiate, we want to bring an end to violence. All that is very reassuring to the international community, and I think they have, I just hope they're not playing the international community, because and they're not speaking with folk tongues. But on the issues of governance, if you look, I don't think they have come out. When you talk to them about democracy or women's rights, everything that is under Sharia, without really expounding or further explanations. So those things are a bit disconcerting, and that is what the Afghan society is also wanting. They would want to understand that what sort of government they would want.
Absolutely. There's so much at stake here for the Afghan society. In fact, most importantly, women and children, and also for all the regional to the global players, which is why, in fact, for New Delhi, every single move and situation that's playing out there is also of so much immense importance. Ambassador Amar Sinha, always a pleasure talking to you and hearing your views. Many thanks for joining us in this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Smita. All the best.
And if all of you joined us in this conversation as well, thank you for tuning in. Here in New Delhi, this is Smita Sharma.